Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 1 through 4, lecture 1. We now reach the last part of the course, where we are looking at the development of political institutions from roughly the time of the French Revolution until the present day. I did not have you read the introduction, and I don't plan to give a lecture on the introduction because since you've read the first volume, Origins of Political Order, he is more or less summarizing what he had to say there. But one thing I do want to mention from the introduction is that he says there that political development, in the sense of change in political institutions, especially the state, rule of law, and accountability over time, that political development has been influenced since 1800 or so by two factors that were not at work really prior to that time, but that have a decisive impact on how nations can develop today. And that those are the Industrial Revolution, which basically takes us out of a Malthusian world and thereby ushers in a different kind of society with different social groups, with different interests and potential alignments. So one factor is the Industrial Revolution, and the other one is colonialism, right? Because colonialism crucially and pervasively affected the developmental paths of most of the non-Western world. And that's something you already know from having read Why Nations Fail. So you have to recognize that even if the basic institutions we're looking at are the same, the state, rule of law, and accountability, the conditions under which those institutions develop are changed significantly because of industrialization and colonization. Now, in the rest of this lecture, I'm just going to talk about chapter 1, which is entitled, What is Political Development? And this is his kind of overview of the topic that he will be exploring in the rest of the book. Now, he defines political development in a very non-controversial way as just change over time in political institutions. Right? That's on page 23. Technically, that's not an adequate definition of political development, because if you're simply talking about change over time, then that would mean that essentially there is no difference between development and decay. But clearly, he thinks that development is good, broadly speaking, or at least that decay is bad, and therefore that development and decay aren't the same thing. So even though he defines political development as the change over time in political institutions, I think sort of operationally, the way he's really approaching the topic is development is improvement over time in political institutions, where improvement is defined more or less in terms of ability to serve the common good, or something like that. So I think that's what he's really talking about. Now, institutions can be hard to define what an institution is. But for Fukuyama, page 23, he defines institutions as the underlying rules by which societies organize themselves. And thus, political institutions are the underlying rules by which societies organize themselves politically, the way they organize their political power. So the fundamental institutions of the regime. The three institutions that he focuses on are, again, the state, rule of law, and accountability. Now, the state, he adopts Max Weber's definition, basically, of what the state is, which is a state is a hierarchical, centralized organization that holds a monopoly on legitimate force over a defined territory and population. Okay? A hierarchical, there's some people at the top. Centralized, the power is there's a clear hierarchy with a single top. Centralized organization that holds a monopoly on legitimate force over a defined territory and population. As he says, states can be more or less complex in terms of the division of labor that they organize themselves internally with. They can be more or less adaptable in terms of being able to address novel problems or circumstances. And they can also be more or less impersonal, and impersonal here in the sense of genuinely applying the same rules to everybody as opposed to making exceptions for some or others. So that's the state. Now, with rule of law, you're talking about a set of rules of behavior that reflect a broad consensus within society and that are binding on even the most powerful political actors in that society. That's the definition he gives on page 24. This is not the same as rule by law, which is where rulers rule the populace by means of laws that they themselves are not constrained by. So the presence of laws does not guarantee rule of law. Rule of law exists where even the powerful are subject to the same rules. The third institution is accountability. And by accountability, he means that the government, those who are in charge, are responsive to the interests of the society at large and not merely to their own interests. Or, colloquially speaking, the rulers believe that they must rule for the good of the community and not simply for their own private gain. Now, accountability can take different forms. As he says, accountability could be substantive, right, in the sense that accountability is primarily brought about through the moral formation of rulers, such that they are molded into the kind of people who believe that that's how they should rule, right? That's part of the point of Confucianism, for example. And that's what you find as an approach oftentimes in ancient political philosophy. You think of the Republic. I mean, there are obviously institutional constraints there too, but a big focus of the Republic is actually the moral formation of the ruling class so that they will not take advantage of the superior force and position that they have to exploit the population. So that's substantive accountability, where the rulers in effect restrain themselves. But you can also have procedural accountability or formal accountability, and that's usually in the form of elections. And as he notes, it seems to be the case that in the long term, you need more formal mechanisms of accountability for accountability to be durable and reliable. So as he says, a good society is going to have a balance of all three of these institutions. But nonetheless, these institutions are separable from one another. They can develop separately from one another, and they can exist in varying combinations. So liberal democracy has a good dose of all three, but it doesn't mean you have to have all three or that they necessarily go together or even that they have to develop in the same order. China gets the state, still doesn't have rule of law. Western Europe and a lot of places you have rule of law before you really have a powerful state. In some places it could be argued you get something like democratic accountability before you really have rule of law or a competent state. So this is why one of the themes that's going to come up in this book is the theme of sequencing. What is the best way to develop these institutions so that you get all three of them in a good and competent mixture? We'll be getting into that. So the next section of the chapter 1 is entitled Getting to Denmark. And Denmark is sort of symbolically his name for a country that has all three of these institutions well developed and working together. So how do you get to Denmark? How can a country that does not have good governing institutions develop governing institutions of the quality that you find in a place such as Denmark? And of course, you have to raise the question, well, how did Denmark become Denmark? Because obviously these people used to be Vikings, right? So how did a bunch of Vikings eventually turn into a nice, stable, prosperous, liberal democracy, right? And in particular, how did it build an effective, impersonal, and competent state? Now, a major problem in terms of state building in the past and today is what he calls patrimonialism or neopatrimonialism, which, as he says, is a quotation from page 26, is where political leaders adopt the outward forms of modern states with bureaucracies, legal systems, elections, and the like, and yet in reality rule for private gain. So that's neopatrimonialism, a situation where private individuals or private groups treat governing institutions sort of as their own personal property to use in order to serve their own particular interests. And as he says, once upon a time, almost all states were patrimonial in character. There was restricted, the who held power was restricted to a fairly narrow group. It was usually defined in terms of particular dynasties or families. And the primary concern oftentimes was the good of the ruling group rather than the good of the whole. So that's patrimonialism or neopatrimonialism, because as he's going to talk about, one of the problems that you find today is that not only are there some countries whose political development has been stalled by patrimonial practices, so basically selfish elites, but you also have the prospect in places such as the United States of a decline or a decay in the quality of government, in part because of a resurgence of neo-patrimonial practices. In the case of the United States, it's not usually going to be particular private families, but it might be particular interest groups or classes within society that have kind of a lock on governmental power and use it to serve their own private interest. So that's neo-patrimonialism. And so then the question becomes, how did impersonal modern states emerge from patrimonial ones, since no early states were really impersonal? So how especially in modern times, how did we get effective impersonal states? And the short story is, there are a couple important factors, especially in Europe, are military competition. That's in Prussia, for example. And Prussia, in that sense, has an experience not that different from, say, some of the states in China during the Warring States period, where military competition was so fierce that the leaders were more or less forced to adopt meritocratic ways of recruiting and promoting bureaucrats, officers, and the like, because the cost of not getting the most talented in place could be the destruction of your state, right? So if you go along with old-fashioned practices of just letting the heads of all the old, rich, noble families run the military, well, those aristocrats, they might be well connected and they might have a lot of money, but that doesn't mean they make good officers. It doesn't mean they make good administrators. And so, the monarch that relies upon amateurish aristocrats could end up losing his estate and his head. So when you have fierce military competition, oftentimes you have a turn towards meritocratic recruitment and promotion practices, which also leads to just overall a more rational structuring of the states. You get a competent military and civilian bureaucracy, and that's what happens in Prussia, as we'll see. So one important factor in the development of effective states is military competition. The other factor, as we'll see, is what he calls the social mobilization caused by industrialization. You find that in England, for example. Now, by social mobilization, what he means is the emergence of new groups in society that engage in collective action in order to promote or to secure their particular interests, in the belief that the existing system does not adequately address them. So obviously the big story in modern Europe is, the emergence of kind of capitalists, and also in the 19th century, the emergence of the industrial working class. Right? If you go back to, say, England in the 1200s, there's no such thing as an industrial working class. That's just not a group within society. And so when you have these new groups emerge from industrialization and urbanization, once they get big enough or powerful enough, they will oftentimes begin to push for some form of political recognition and political power. So the social mobilization driven by industrialization and military competition are two major factors in the development of the modern competent state, especially in Europe. Okay. Now, he next in this chapter moves on to a section entitled Political Decay, where he says a little bit about this phenomenon. And he says political development involves institutions becoming more complex, adaptable, autonomous, and coherent. Those are not his criteria. I believe he takes those over from Huntington. He doesn't define them here. He defined them near the end of Origins of Political Order. I don't expect you necessarily to understand or to be able to provide at will a definition of these factors. When you're talking about an institution becoming more complex, what that means is the institution has developed a more refined internal division of labor in order to address its tasks. So it's a kind of complexity is somewhat akin to professionalization, where you really become kind of, you have your tasks well portioned out in order to efficiently do the tasks that your institution is tasked with doing. So complex means a more complex division of labor. Adaptable means, sort of the ability to respond to changing circumstances or changing demands. Sometimes complexity and adaptability actually can be in tension with one another. That if you have a really kind of tightly designed organization to address some particular task, and then the environment changes around you, you might have to radically change your institution in order to adapt. But so adaptability just, it means something like, what colloquially we mean by flexibility, the ability to sort of change as circumstances change in a way that allows you to continue to carry out your primary mission. Autonomy means something like a sense of identity, a sense of mission. So does your institution have a real kind of esprit de corps where it knows what it stands for and what it's there to do? Coherence, we don't need to get into. Coherence has to do with whether you have redundancies and overlaps among institutions. So development primarily involves complexity, adaptability, and autonomy. Coherence can be especially a problem in the United States. We won't need to get into that now. And so political decay just means reversal in any of these areas, becoming less adaptable, becoming less complex, becoming less autonomous, becoming less coherent. That's the abstract definition. So what decay looks like in detail, we will get to later. Obviously, one of the major problems, or one of the major sources of political decay, is simply failure to adapt to changing circumstances, especially since institutions tend to be kind of conservative in the sense that people in institutions usually try to keep doing things the way they're already doing things. So when things change, it can be hard to get people to do that, especially if they're stakeholders in the status quo. As you might recall from the previous book, one of the things that ended up making the French Revolution almost inevitable was the fact that you had so many kind of parasitic stakeholders in the status quo of the ancien regime that even necessary reforms, even good reforms, were just simply impossible. Now, another source of decay, besides failure to adapt, is repatrimonialization, right? And this is something that I was talking about before, and this seems to be kind of a natural tendency during times of peace and prosperity. That when states are relatively secure, people kind of get attached to them. Their interests get defined in terms of them. The people who hold power get used to holding power, and they start using that power to serve their own good. Peace and prosperity here, the reason why that enables this is because, again, oftentimes when countries face existential threats from the outside, that can be a spur to efficiency and reform. And we don't have that kind of outside pressure. Things kind of relax a little bit, and people start, trying to game the system more often. Now, obviously, there is absolutely no guarantee that modern liberal democracies are exempt from repatrimonialization or failure to adapt. In fact, there's evidence that they are quite prone to these two things. So we have elections which can provide some kind of correction when there are problems going on, but there's no guarantee of self-correction, and there's no guarantee that liberal democratic institutions are essentially adaptable or that they are immune from repatrimonialization. Quite the opposite. These are all themes that we'll be getting to as we read the book. Now, the last part of the chapter is called After the Revolution, and it's an overview of what he'll be doing in Volume 2, right? And it kind of begins with this reflection that the Industrial Revolution really caused rapid social and economic changes with big social consequences, really kind of mixed up the existing order. So part 1 of the book is a study of the state in the modern Western industrial world, where you see that competent states tend to develop from authoritarian governments under military pressure. That is something you find in Europe. Countries that democratize early have a hard time building competent states. And here he'll be giving the examples of Greece and Italy, among others. So this is why he says sequence matters. That he thinks that the ideal way to develop is to get a strong state before you become democratic, because it is possible for strong states to become democratic and stay strong. Whereas if you become democratic before you have a competent state built, it can prove to be very difficult to build a competent state when you have elections and democratic accountability. And we'll see why as we move along. Now, part two is about the non-Western world. So in other words, the colonialized world for the most part. And here, the big focus is on how development is influenced by two things, both the quality of the institutions in place prior to colonization, right? So what were the institutions like before the country was colonized, or the people was colonized? And the second factor is the manner in which a country is colonized. Because you can have indirect colonization, where the colonial power primarily rules through proxies, as in much of Africa, or you can have more intensive colonization, such as what you had in India. And how a country is colonized can make a big difference for the quality of its subsequent government. As he says at the bottom of page 31, ultimately, geographical determinism obscures the many ways people in colonized countries exercised agency. They played crucial roles in shaping their own institutions despite outside domination, but the most successful non-Western countries today are precisely those that had the most developed indigenous institutions prior to their contact with the West. Right. So I want to emphasize that, because that's something that Acemoglu and Robinson don't talk about quite so much in Why Nations Fail. In Why Nations Fail, there tends to be a focus on the way in which sort of a lot of the indigenous institutions are sort of appropriated and then obliterated through colonization. But we'll see when we get further into it. We'll see what Fukuyama has to say about that. But so it's important to see that in a way that colonization does not simply wipe the slate clean in terms of how countries develop subsequently, even after the colonial occupiers leave. Now, part three, he shifts from the state to democracy and talks about the development of democracy as a result of changing ideas and also as a result of societies being changed by industrialization. And there's one passage here that I wanted to read to you on page 34. This is in the middle, more or less, of the one big paragraph on page 34, where he says, the timing of the spread of democracy in different countries, therefore, depended on the changing relative positions of the middle class, the working class, landowning elites, and the peasantry. Where the old agrarian order was built around large landowners dependent on servile labor, a peaceful transition to democracy became particularly difficult. But in almost all cases, the rise and growth of middle-class groups was critical to the spread of democracy. Democracy in the developed world became secure and stable as industrialization produced middle-class societies. That is, societies in which a significant majority of the population thought of themselves as middle class. So you have the importance of the middle class, which of course immediately leads to a question, which he mentions on page 35, and which has been an issue since the Great Recession, explicitly an issue since the Great Recession, which is what happens to liberal democracy if the middle class declines? If the middle class was so important for the spread and the stabilization of democracy, does that mean that if your society becomes more economically polarized, that you're going to lose your democratic institutions? It's an interesting question, and we'll talk more about it as we go. Now, then part four has to do with political decay. And in this section, he becomes a little bit more parochial and talks primarily about the United States and the failure of the United States government to adapt to changes, and also the he thinks rampant phenomenon of repatrimonialization in American government. So in the next lecture, I will move on to chapter 2, which is entitled Dimensions of Development.